Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So, today, most of you are aware that Wagner forces have ceased their movement towards the capital of the Russian Federation, Moscow. That has stopped. There are some indications that the head of the Wagner paramilitary organization, mercenary organization, may be looking to go into exile in Belarus. Now, is that going to happen? Ultimately, we don't know. Is this a good look for the current Russian government? And what I mean a good look in terms of what occurred. Having this mercenary army roll into Rostov-on-Don, roll into areas such as Voronezh, and then eventually be engaged by Russian air assets within the vicinity of Voronezh. Is it a good look? No, it's not. But it appears to be, at least on the surface, it appears to be over. Now, could we see some shakeup? Could we see some changes within the Russian military command structure? Could we see possibly within the next 30, 60, 90 days Gerasimov being removed? Could we see Shoigu being removed as defense minister? Possibly. I would not rule that out. Is there possibly a better fit for war conditions that the Kremlin could place in charge of the Ministry of Defense? Possibly. Possibly. In all probability, the Russians need to find a very good battlefield commander that can create a unified command structure and continue to fight the war against the Ukrainians. Now, as long as we have these Wagner organizations that are not answering to the Russian Ministry of Defense, that is inherently going to cause problems. It just is. But here's what we do know. Over the past 24, 48 hours, we have seen the Wagner forces withdraw from areas near Bakhmut. We have seen that happen. And the Russians are still maintaining control over Bakhmut. Regular Russian ground forces have been brought in and are continuing to maintain control over Bakhmut and the environs around Bakhmut. Yes, the Ukrainians are attempting continued offensive operations north and to a limited extent to the south of Bakhmut. But Bakhmut right now remains essentially secure and well defended by Russian forces. So, with those Wagner forces withdrawing away from the line of contact, away from the front line, and with the majority of forces now facing the Ukrainians are regular Russian ground forces, regular Russian VDV formations, airborne troops, Spetsnaz formations, elements of the Russian National Guard to include Chechen formations. Do we still essentially have a frozen conflict? Why did we not see the Ukrainian army make an all-out attempt towards weakened areas along the Russian front lines? I think the answer to that is that since the early part of June, the Ukrainians had been trying that. And ultimately, they have faced extensive casualties. And as I talked about before, the Ukrainian offensive has stalled. It's not going anywhere. They are reassessing, and it looks like they did not have the offensive capacity once NATO, once the United States, once the Ukrainian intelligence became aware of what was happening inside of Russia regarding Wagner. They still did not have the capability to launch an effective offensive. Didn't happen. And again, if we look at the defensive lines that the Russians have set up, some are multiple layers deep, as you can see here. Again, the main defensive line of the Russians is, if we measure this, is about 12 kilometers from the main line of contact, from the gray zone. And that's purposely done because the Russians, again, use their artillery back behind that main line of defense to shell and pummel Ukrainian forces that do attempt offensive operations. So I think what we have is essentially right now a frozen conflict. And if you look at the areas where Russia has created these defensive lines, the only areas where they're not as prevalent, you would say the area just to the west of Donetsk, the main city. Obviously, areas near Bakhmut. But more importantly, this area here, just to the north of Seversk, near Kreminna. We are not seeing a lot of Russian defensive lines being set up in this area. And I think, again, the reason behind that is I suspect that the Russians could be preparing for large-scale offensive operations in this area. We have seen limited Russian offensive operations to regain the initiative in this area, but I think the Russians are continuing to look west of Kreminna, west of Seversk, looking at Sloviansk, Kramatorsk as a target of opportunity. I think ultimately the Russians still have the goal of seizing control of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Now, when is that going to happen? Difficult to say. I think the internal issues within the Russian Federation are going to have to get rectified. Is this the end of seeing Wagner formations on the front line? I don't think so. I think those units could be renamed, rebranded, but ultimately I think we'll see them back in action against Ukrainian forces. It was very apparent that during this operation by Wagner forces, at the end of the day, neither side wanted to draw a lot of blood. It was not in the best interest of the country to see that happen. And I think ultimately common sense prevailed. And look, the military formations of Wagner are made up of some very patriotic former members of the Russian armed forces. And inherently, those individuals in Wagner would be facing down and fighting current members of the Russian armed forces, current members of the Russian National Guard, if they were to have continued north towards Moscow. And I think cooler heads probably prevailed. And ultimately, as far as Russia is concerned, they are facing a far greater foe in terms of what they perceive as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, who are backing the Ukrainians. So I think at the end of the day, both sides fully understand who and what their true enemy is. And that's why we saw what we saw happen over the last 24 hours. But we will continue to watch. We will continue to report what is going on. Obviously, it made for a fairly interesting news cycle, especially the last 24 hours, as Wagner tanks and armored infantry fighting vehicles were moving north. And then compounding that, the use of Russian attack helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft going after some of those Wagner convoys. And again, there was some limited exchanges of combat. So that's kind of where we stand for today. We will continue to watch. We will continue to report. Thank you for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.